We are finishing today a 4-week series that we have entitled Easter Explains Everything. We launched it on Easter. Obviously, when we say Easter explains everything, we're talking about the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ explains everything. It is a life-defining, paradigm-shifting historical event that will redefine everything about your life. And matter of fact, over the last several weeks, in week 1, we talked about how Easter or the resurrection explains or defines history. The whole calendar is set based on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We talked about in week 2 how the resurrection of Jesus defines or explains all of Scripture. And then in week 3, we said Easter explains or defines our future. And then this week, I want us to see today, the last day of the series, how Easter explains the kingship of Jesus. And if I had a subtitle, it would be, and why it should matter to you. Easter, the resurrection explains the kingship of Jesus and why it should matter to you. We've spent the last 4 weeks in Luke chapter 24 because that chapter describes several events that occur immediately following the resurrection. But today I want us to go all the way down to the bottom of that chapter, look at the last 3 verses, because those verses describe Jesus' ascension. Here's what it says in verse 50. Then Jesus led them to Bethany, and lifting up his hands to heaven, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up to heaven. So they worshiped him and then returned to Jerusalem filled with great joy. And they spent all their time in the temple praising God. Now, there is more happening here than what looks like is happening here. This is not just Jesus' ascension into heaven. This is Jesus' ascension to take his throne. This is the climactic ending of a passage in the Bible that is all about the kingship of Jesus. Easter, the resurrection, explains the kingship of Jesus. As a matter of fact, earlier in Luke 24, twice, like back to back, Jesus refers to himself as the king. Now, you may have missed that in our previous conversations because Jesus doesn't use the word king. He uses the word Messiah. And I want you to see in that conversation where he's talking with the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, he says this in verse 26, wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah, he's talking about himself, that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory? Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from the scriptures the things concerning himself, calling himself the Messiah. And then a few verses later, he says basically the same thing in a room where his disciples had gathered, verse 45. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures and said, yes, it was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the 3rd day. So twice in a matter of a few short verses, Jesus refers to himself as the Messiah. Now, I know the word Messiah and the word king don't sound anything alike. And I realize to most English speakers, we don't use Messiah and king as synonyms. But to the Jewish men who were hearing this conversation for the first time, the connection would have been blatantly clear. They would have known without a doubt that Jesus was claiming to be the one true and anointed king. Matter of fact, the word for Messiah in the Hebrew is Mashiach, which literally means the anointed king. So Luke 24, all these days Jesus has spent on the earth after his resurrection culminates in this one moment where Jesus is going out by calling himself the one true king, and then he ascends into heaven to take his throne. The resurrection explains and validates the kingship of Jesus. But why should that matter to you? What's the big deal about the kingship of Jesus? Well, let me try to take the next few minutes and explain why it should matter to you. An Episcopalian minister who visited from England to the U.S., he was a British minister, came to the U.S. to visit here, and he went to check out the Revolutionary War Museum in Philadelphia. And as he was walking through all of that American Revolution stuff, all the Revolutionary War memorabilia, America's revolt against the British monarchy, he saw a sign that was basically a remnant of the Revolutionary War. That sign at one time hung over a tavern during the Revolution in Philadelphia. And the sign said this, in big, bold letters, it said this: we have no sovereign here. And he said, this minister who came from England to visit the U.S., he said, of all the things I saw and all the things I experienced while I was here in the U.S., nothing summed up the culture and the psychology and the philosophy of the American people more than that sign. Australians, Canadians, Europeans all have some positive memory of bowing their knee to a king. But the American mentality is, we have no sovereign here. As a matter of fact, even me saying that is causing some of you subconsciously to stiffen your spine and a little patriotic pride, because it's like, you're right, Pastor, we don't bow our knee to anybody. I am an individual and I decide what is right and wrong for me. We serve no sovereign here. But here's the problem. That mindset, we serve no sovereign here, hasn't just impacted our culture and our philosophy and our psychology. It's impacted our religious beliefs and the way we perceive God. C.S. Lewis wrote a little article many, many years ago called Equality. And in the article, he basically starts out by saying, don't misunderstand me, I am absolutely in favor of democracy. Lewis says totally and absolutely, because we are sinners in a world governed by imperfect and sinful people, so we need a model of governance where there is checks and balances, and democracy provides that. But Lewis made this statement in the article: democracy is medicine, it is not food. Democracy is the political and governmental medicine for what ails the deeply flawed human race. But it is not, nor ever will be, the food that fills the deep hunger and craving in the human heart. Because God created the human heart to be ruled. That's right, you and I were created by God to be ruled by God. He hardwired the human heart to crave His kingship, to passionately desire His kingdom. I mean, realize that the word kingdom literally means the king's dominion. Kingdom means the king's dominion. So God put a hole in every human heart that will always feel empty apart from God's sovereign and kingly rule. His dominion causes our lives to flourish. When His rule and reign are the priorities of our life, only then will we experience life as it was intended. The sovereign rule of God, the dominion of the King, is what made the Garden of Eden paradise. That's where humanity flourished. That's where Adam and Eve lived life at its pinnacle. It was the way it was supposed to be. But sin tarnished everything. Now, sin didn't take away our craving for a king. It just corrupted our craving for a king. It clouded our perception. Our hearts still long for a monarch. We still have this deep internal need to be ruled. But because of sin, now we just can't figure out who or what we want ruling our lives. You see this corrupted craving early on in the history of God's people. The people of Israel, God had been their king. He had been their monarch. He dealt with them intimately. But they got to looking at all the other nations of the world, and they wanted to be like everybody else. And they started asking, we want a king like everybody. We want an earthly king like everybody else. And so this corrupted craving for a king, overthrowing the rule and reign of God in our life, has happened way back in the very beginning. And humanity's craving for its monarch has not waned. In 2011, it's estimated that 2 billion people, that's a B, 2 billion people stopped what they were doing to watch a wedding between a relatively unknown woman, Kate Middleton, watch her marry a British prince, Prince William. Why? Why did 2 billion people stop their lives to watch that? Or in 2018, they say even more people watched Meghan Markle marry Prince Harry. Why is the world so infatuated with the British monarchy? Because somewhere deep down inside us, the human heart is craving to be ruled. We are craving our king. And that God-designed craving was put in our heart by God to drive us to Him, to cause us to crave Him. But if you don't acknowledge Jesus as king, you will serve somebody or something else as your king. Your heart will bow its knee to something. Now, you won't call it that. You'll never admit that. But your heart so desperately craves a king that you will crown something. You will crown somebody. You will crown and bow to something in your life. You'll crown your career as your king. You will crown your beauty as your king. You will crown your financial portfolio as your king. You will crown your sexuality as your king. You will crown your politics as your king. If Jesus isn't your king, you will bow your knee to somebody or something else. And the search for our ruler has turned the human race into king makers. That's what we are. In search of our king, we are bowing our knees to celebrities and athletes and politicians and even pastors. One of the most sobering conversations in my life happened a little over 10 years ago in the small lobby of our old building back on 3rd Street in Saxe prior to moving to this location. An older gentleman I have incredible respect for had just come out of the prayer room. I had been in a meeting with our board, and he had come out of the prayer room, and it's obvious he had been burdened in prayer, and based on the conversation, I knew that he'd been burdened for me. I could tell he had been weeping in his burden while he prayed, and he saw me. It was a divine appointment, no doubt in my mind. God orchestrated him to be there praying and me to be there because this conversation totally recalibrated my entire life. He walked up to me, got in my face, clenched my shirt on my shoulders with his 2 fists, pulled me up close. I could see tears running down his cheeks, and with his lips quivering, he said this, "Don't let us make you a king." And then he went on and said, as a counselor that has been called in to help pick up the shattered pieces of what remained in the lives of ministers that have been crushed and burned under the weight of unhealthy expectations, Brian, I beg you, don't let us make you a king. He went on to say, I've stared in the hollow eyes of a lot of gifted men who became the shells of the men they used to be because we tried to make them our king. We're king makers, Pastor. The human race has been searching for a king since it rebelled against God in Eden. And if you let us, we will try to make you our king. We'll never call it that, but that's what we're doing. We take rising stars like you, young leaders with charisma, gifts, and anointing. We elevate you, and then we crown you. And then we put ungodly expectations and pressure on you that will eventually crush you. And then when we've used you up, we will leave you to wallow in the shattered pieces of your own life, your own marriage, with your own broken children, while we move on to the next rising star and start the process all over again, destroying them, because we're king makers. And it will never work for you. It will never work for us, because you were never meant to carry that weight. There is only one true king. And while clenching my shirt and tears running down his cheeks, his face 2 inches from mine, he said something I'll never forget. He was old enough to be my father, and he said, "Son, whatever you do, don't take the crown." I've been the pastor here 16 years. When I first showed up, I was 31. Haley was 29. The church was a lot smaller then, and along the way, we've had consultants and marketing experts that tried to tell us that if we wanted to market the church the way we needed to do, it needed to have our image, mine and Haley's image and persona out front, because this is what they said early on: youth sells. And at that time, we were 83, 84-year-old church. If you want to turn an established church around, the community needs to know they have a young pastor. So you need your picture on billboards, and you need it in newspapers and magazines. And I never let that happen. It just didn't feel right to me. It's not my personality. It's not what I like. It just didn't set with me. So I never really let that happen. Now, it happened a few times, but it was without my knowledge and my permission. And I found it when I saw it. And when I did, the responsible party and I had an intense moment of fellowship. Okay. Because I don't want the crown. The office staff will tell you the fastest way to trip my fuse is to put mine and Haley's picture on church advertisements, because it was never supposed to be about one person's personality or one family. The focus has to remain on the community of faith and their one true King. Now, let me tell you, I do have to have an honest confession here. My feelings are a little hurt because nobody in the last few years has put any pressure on me to put my picture on a billboard. And I'm sure it's because they got the hint and has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I'm now bald and almost 50 years old. They said those things when I was 31, not 47. Occasionally, now not as much now as in the past, occasionally, we're maturing as a church. We're growing up as a church. But occasionally, people will complain when I'm not the one in the pulpit. I intentionally take weeks off. Maybe I'm investing in my family, or I'm on a missions trip, or I just want to be a Christian today, and I want to receive ministry. But behind the and when I have a guest speaker, Pastor Scotty or one of our staff pastors preach, or somebody else comes through, there'll be a little rumbling because I wasn't in the pulpit. I invited friends and you weren't there. I hear all those kind of, well, that's a good reason to invite them back again. You know, I mean, but the complaint, I hear a few rumbles, not as much as used to. But let me tell you this. I want you to know this. One of the underlying reasons I love to preach more than I like to eat. Okay? But one of the underlying reasons I won't be in the pulpit every Sunday is because I want the message loud and clear to you. I am not the king. I don't want the crown. In reality, I'm preparing you for your next pastor. I'm not going to be here forever. And for those of you that don't like me, you're hoping it's soon, but it's not. I don't have any plans on leaving soon. But no matter how long I'm here, it won't last forever. I am not an owner. I am a steward. I'm just running one leg of a race, and I got to hand that baton off to somebody else. I am the trustee of a trust. I am the cupbearer to the king. I am not the king. I don't want the crown. Listen, the human heart craves a king, and if Jesus isn't in the rightful place on the throne of your heart, if he is not your king, maybe you believe in him, but if he is not your king, you will end up turning anybody and anything else into your monarch, into your ruler, into your king. And lean into this. Hear me. There are a lot of people who go to church, a lot of people who profess a belief in Jesus, but they are fooling themselves because they have a belief in Jesus, but they're not treating him as their king. Instead of a king, they have turned Jesus into their consultant. And there is a massive difference between Jesus as king and Jesus as consultant. So how do you know the difference? How do you know if you're serving Jesus as king or you're serving Jesus as consultant? Well, let me just practice. I'm going to give you 3 practical heart checks today that you can judge your own heart by and ask yourself, is Jesus my king or is Jesus my consultant? And only you can answer that question. You and him, we're the only 2 people know that answer. And you need to answer it today. Here's the first test. You obey a king. You know you're treating Jesus as king if you obey him. When you do whatever he says, whether you like it or not, whether it's convenient or not. I mean, let me just give you a few of the things the king says, all right? Here's what the king says in his word. Always forgive. Always. Always tell the truth. Always. Don't envy. Don't return evil with evil, but return evil with good. Treat sex as the renewal of a commitment and covenant and a permanent exclusive marriage. Now, there's so many more, so many other things the king said, but these are just a few of his demands, his requirements. None of us are going to be perfect. But there is a huge difference in the life of someone who's treating Jesus like their king and someone who is treating Jesus like their consultant. Matter of fact, some of us today are bitter. There is unforgiveness in our heart and we're harboring a grudge. And when we do, we're walking in disobedience to the king. We're literally throwing off the rule and dominion of the king and choosing it to do it our way. Bitterness will destroy you. Unforgiveness will destroy your life. So you have to understand, when the king says to obey him, he's not trying to put restrictions on your life to be a cosmic killjoy. He knows how life works. And his reign and his rule, living within that, is when your life flourishes. It's when you find real freedom. If you get outside the rule and the reign of the king, it's self-destructive. Unforgiveness, bitterness will destroy your life. Living under his rule is where freedom is found. If you say, I'll obey if it's practical, I'll obey the king. If it feels good, I'll obey. If it's popular, you're not obeying. It's proof that you're just seeing Jesus' words as recommendations, but you're still sleeping with who and when you want to sleep, and sleep with who and when, whenever. You're still forgiving when you want to, and however. You're defining forgiveness. You're defining sexuality. Listen, if you look at the words of Jesus as recommendations to be considered and not commands to be obeyed, he's not your king. He's your consultant. You obey a king. But the mentality of most people, and even many in the church, is we have no sovereign here. In Matthew 11, Jesus said this, "Take my yoke upon you, let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart." And listen to this promise. When you take his yoke, you will find rest for your souls. His yoke is his rule. His yoke is his reign. His yoke is his way. It's his dominion. And he says, if you will submit to my dominion, if you will submit to my yoke, your life will finally find rest. It will finally flourish. You will start reaching your full potential. Think of it this way. Just say you got a young person who's showing some promise. They have a desire and they're showing some promise in some area, athletics or art. They are never going to unlock that full potential in their life without the rigor, the monotony, and the pain, discipline, and long-term consistency of practice. They have to yoke themselves to practice. Okay, let's use art. Use up the piano. My mom tried to get me to play the piano. She had to make me. Finally, look, as much as she was the parent, she got tired of trying to force me something that I didn't want to do. And I go back to her and I say, now, why didn't you make me stay with it? Okay? Because I don't have the freedom of that gift. I wish I would have stuck it out. Anybody that's ever achieved greatness at the piano did what they didn't want to do. They hated it, but they stuck with it. And by being yoked to the piano through practice and monotony and consistency, there was a freedom that was found in the yoke. The yoke eventually becomes a refuge. The confinement eventually becomes spaciousness. The servitude eventually becomes freedom. It's where the gift begins to flourish. Expression is found only through submission to the yoke. In the same way, there is potential in you to live life that will never be realized outside of his rule, his yoke, his kingship. But in servitude, you will find freedom. In the confinement of his yoke, you will find spaciousness. In his yoke, you will one day see a refuge. And if you ever choose to try to throw off the yoke of the king in your life, it will eventually lead you to destruction, because his rule and his way and his kingdom is the only place this life of ours was designed to find freedom and flourishing. Treat him as king. Obey him. Do whatever he says, whether it comes easy or not. You know Jesus is your king when you obey him. Second, you know Jesus is king when you trust him. You trust a king. You know you're treating Jesus like your king when you absolutely, unequivocally have put all your weight on him. You completely and totally trust him, which practically means, this is what it practically looks like. You're willing to accept whatever God sovereignly brings into your life or allows to happen in your life. Whether you understand it or not, you trust his character, his faithfulness, you rely on him, you trust him. A lot of people believe in Jesus until suffering and hardship and adversity comes. In my first pastorate, there was a man I became really good friends with, and I was his pastor. he led more people, more influential people to Jesus than anybody I'd ever known at that time. He was on fire for God. And everywhere he went, I mean, every Sunday there were people coming into the church, and from politicians and business people all across our community. We had a university in the town. I mean, this guy was leading people to Jesus right and left. I mean, I was shocked. If there was an Andrew that I ever met in my life, Andrew is the one that brought the Apostle Peter to Jesus. This guy was an Andrew. He just had the gift of evangelism and connected people to the heart of God. Well, he'd seen God do so many miracles in other people's lives. He came down with a physical ailment, a sickness that created incredible pain in his body. He came to the church for prayer. He asked me for prayer. We prayed months led to years. And over time, his prayers were not answered. God did not take the thorn away in his flesh like Paul prayed. Paul said, your grace is sufficient. This gentleman didn't come to that conclusion. He got bitter at God, got bitter at the situation, ended up getting bitter at church, getting bitter at me. And today, this many years later, he is still a hurting, very bitter man. Suffering, hardship, and adversity will prove whether or not Jesus is your king or your consultant. If he is your king, you will trust him no matter what comes into your life. Job, who suffered more than any of us can even fathom or imagine, empties his heart in Job 23 about the heartache. He feels like God has been absent in his suffering. And he's like, where are you? Why is this happening? And he spills his guts in Job 23. But after he's emptied his soul in prayer to God, this is what he says. But he knows the way I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. God, I don't understand it, Job said. I don't know why it's happening. I can't explain it to my friends, but this is the one thing I know. You are good and you're faithful, and I don't have to understand it. I'm just going to trust you because I know you're going to try me as gold over a fire, and in the end, it's all going to make sense, and you're going to use it for your glory. What is Job saying when he said, he knows the way I take? He's saying, I trust his kingship in my life. I'm going to rely on him even though what's going on in my life doesn't make sense. But a lot of us don't rely on him. We believe in him, but we don't trust him. You know what we really believe? You know what we really trust? Do you know whatever you find your self-worth and identity in, that's what you've made your king. So we say we believe in Jesus, but we're relying on our career. We've made our career king. Or we've made whatever gives you your greatest sense of self-worth and whatever gives you your greatest sense of identity, that thing is what you've made the monarch of your life. So you believe in Jesus, but that other thing has become your king. You obey a king. You trust a king. But finally, you expect great things from a king. A king is powerful. A king is authoritative. A king has resources. And a king loves his people enough to use that power and those resources on the behalf of his people. So treat Jesus like a king. Expect great things from him. Treat him like a king in your prayer life. Pray big, bold, audacious prayers. Hear me. Bold prayers honor God, and God honors bold prayers. The king isn't offended by your big dreams and your bold prayers. He really is offended by anything less, because if your prayers aren't impossible to you, then they're insulting to God. Why? Because then those prayers require no divine intervention. So to use biblical perspective, ask him to part a Red Sea in your life. Ask him to cause the sun to stand still in your life. Ask him to make an iron axe head float again. Do the impossible. There's nothing the king loves more than keeping promises and answering prayers and performing miracles and fulfilling dreams. That's who he is. That's what a king does. The great hymn writer, John Newton, and you know his name because he wrote Amazing Grace. But in another one of his hymns, John Newton understood this. You expect, if you're going to treat Jesus like a king, you got to expect great things from him. If you've got a pessimistic view about Jesus in your life, you're not treating him like a king. John Newton knew that. So this is a lyric, a famous quote of John Newton in another hymn. He said, "Thou art coming to a king. large petitions with thee bring. For his grace and power are such, none can ever ask too much. None can ever ask too much. He's the king. You obey a king, you trust a king, and you expect great things from the king. The resurrection proves that Jesus is the king that your heart has always longed for. Easter explains the kingship of Jesus. But why should it matter to you? Well, if he's king, it means he's in control. And I don't know about you, but more right now than any other time in my life, I have been running to my king for refuge. I have been reminding myself of the sovereign control of God in this life. I have been reminding my children of the sovereign control of God in this world more than any other time. This is why it matters to me. He's king. I'm just a little surprised at Christians over the last few months that are wringing their hands, wondering, walking around like it's the end of the world because of political stuff. It's like they're nervous and they can't sleep at night. Look, I got a burden for this country, and I think God is grieving over sin and he's grieving over the brokenness. But you hear me, he is not nervous. He is not nervous. If the way the church has been acting the last few months at large is giving the world an image of God, this is what the world thinks God is doing. Oh God, I didn't know that. That surprised me. I didn't know that was going to happen. I mean, you would think God had abdicated his throne. He hasn't. He's king. He's sovereign. You know what it means? It means he's in control of everybody else that think they are in control. The king is in control of who's in control. They are all just pawns on his sovereign chessboard, and one day the king is going to say, checkmate, and it's all going to be over. Quit acting like the king's not on his throne. He's not nervous. He is not surprised. He has built his kingdom in every era of history. He's expanding his kingdom in communist China. He has built his kingdom under tyrants and dictators and every president this nation has ever held, and he will keep building his kingdom. Your politics are not your king. Your money is not your king. Nothing. There is only one true king. Jesus. Come on, stand with me all over this place today. We're going to go right back into worship because there's only one thing we can do in a service like this, and that is crown him. And the way we crown him is with our worship. There is a lyric in this song that says, God of glory, majesty, praise be forever to the King of kings. Come on. Make a shift in your heart. Fire the consultant and submit to the king. Crown him. He's worthy. One of our elders came to me during the services this morning. This is, in our context, the gifts of the Spirit in operation, a prophetic word of comfort, encouragement, and exhortation. And listen, I want you to, this is a love letter from God delivered for somebody in this room. Pastor, he said, we just sense that there is somebody here today who is in a life or death situation, and they need to know that God has seen them, he heard them, he knows their address. And listen, friend, I don't know if that situation for you is because your eternity, where you spend eternity, is going to hang in the balance, or if it's a physical situation or in a relationship, it's life or death. I want you to know, let Jesus be the king in that situation. And I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that Jesus would be the king in that situation. Just know, out of all the people in the room, if you're in a life or death situation right now, there's some pressure that you would define as a life or death situation. God put you on somebody's heart and brought it to me through our process here, and just saying, hey, I love you, I see you, I haven't forsaken you, I'm with you, all right? There are some of you in this room that need to make a decision today to make him king. He's been consultant, but that's not good enough. He needs to be king. You've been using His word as a recommendation, but not something you truly yoked yourself to. And today the light bulb went off in your heart. You know, you know, and you're ready to make a decision. 400 plus people have made that decision in the last 4 weeks. And I've been carrying this coin in my pocket to pray for you, because anybody that stepped across that line and made that decision in the last 4 weeks picked up one of these coins when they left the building. And so I'm keeping this with me so that I can remember to pray for you. And I believe some of you made that shift in the song. You said, Jesus, I want more. I don't want you to be my consultant. I've given you part of me. I'm not giving you all of me. And today I'm going all in. The rest of you, I'm just telling you, today is the day for somebody, and I feel it more right now in this service than in any service all day long. This is a life-changing moment of decision for somebody in this room. And I'm going to pray for you that Jesus steps into this moment. And if you make this decision in this moment, go to Guest Connect or Next Steps on your way out. This coin has a picture of the empty tomb on one side. And it's a reminder, a memorial to you that this was the day. But more than that, more than this memorial coin, next Sunday we're having water baptism. And it is a celebration of life change. The Bible says if you are buried with Him in baptism, you will be raised with Him in the resurrection. Jesus said, if you confess me before men, I'll confess you before my Father which is in heaven. Public profession of faith through water baptism is a way to say, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He is my King. There are ways to connect. You'll see them on your screens. You can stop by Guest Connect or in the lobby today at Next Steps, and they can make sure you get connected. Join the celebration. If you've never been baptized with water, you're one of the 400 plus people that have picked up your coin. It's time to celebrate in water baptism. Let me pray for you. Father, thank you for the men and women in this room today who are making a decision. I want more than a consultant. I want to take the yoke upon me. My life will finally find rest when I live under the submission to His yoke. In His yoke is refuge. In His yoke is freedom. Father, would you let men and women in this room today confess with their mouth and believe in their heart that you are Lord and that you were raised from the dead, and that resurrection changes everything. Cleanse sin. Cover us with your righteousness. And God, for that man or woman in this room that's in a life or death situation, would you be king of that moment, king of that life, king of that situation, and turn it around for your glory. Bless them and keep them. Make your face shine down upon them. Be gracious to them. Turn your countenance their direction and give them peace. In Jesus' name.